So I'll just do a very quick introduction about myself in the next 15 minutes, which were born out of a conversation with Gab over the phone a while ago, where we were discussing about open source, ING, what open source does. And he says, well, why don't you come at our event and you share what we are discussing essentially. So first of all, I'd like to introduce very briefly ING, European bank, Netherlands-based. I'm the CTO and member of the board in that place. A very technology-driven bank. I mean, today, meanwhile, most banks are very technology-driven, but ING started very early on. About a third of the bank is engineers. It's about 20,000 people. And we started going agile very early on, 400 squads, 400 tribes and 3,000 squads. We run 300,000 plus pipelines per week. We have about 50-something open source projects on GitHub, where we have been intensively working, contributing, and we use a lot of open source inside the organization. So it's a company that has been built on technology at scale, essentially, and has also a view and an opinion on open source. Today, I had 4 messages for you that I wanted to share. It's on here, this one. Yeah. It's a non-PowerPoint for once. I still need to have it on screen. We can look at the background. Yeah, I have to look at your faces and then I see if it's on or not. So now, I'm sorry, I will lose the drama of the mind map where I can open branches. So just follow what I'm saying and try not to read everything up front, because I have 4 messages for you, essentially. Here we are. So this was the intro, repository, microservices. I mean, this is all boring. Yeah, it's good. So let me just zoom briefly on the 4 messages. First message, financial sector and demand for standards, right? So we are a highly regulated industry. In Europe, we are a European bank, and what we observe is a hefty degree of fragmentation of the European Union. Fragmentation in regulation terms, same regulations ruling the same, right? But always with slightly different definitions. Regulations across countries. I mean, GDPR is a phenomenal one. Yes, it's a European regulation, but then I cannot extract data from Germany to bring them in the Netherlands or the other way around because GDPR. So fragmentation is killing us. And fragmentation is also visible in the way EU is investing and funding. Because fragmentation leads to the native fragmentation of Europe leads to a native fragmentation of investments, which leads to an atomization of the effort, which leads to very little true European solutions we can build on. Right? So that's the challenge we face on the European fragmentation. Also to add, anti-competition laws, we are not allowed to talk to other banks, essentially. Law does not allow us. Now, we got waivers from the regulator because on everything reliability and resiliency, we have to talk with the others. Right? And talking to the others has to be also made in a way and in a language that allows us to be out of anti-competition. Open standards can help there. Because if we can converge and agree on standards which are public, there is no anti-competition effect, there is no distortion. Right? So that has a value for us, and it's one of the things that we are emerging. And then the other point, cybersecurity. Now, cybersecurity is a known field. There are plenty of standards, but AI is adding a bit because it's an emerging threat, right? And there are some frameworks and some standards which we adopt and we try to navigate. But here again, having a common language on what do we understand exactly in that space would be extremely valuable. And here again is speaking for open standards. The same is with interaction with agencies, right? So, secret services, quote unquote, not many quotes, right? Today, the mechanism is very unidirectional. So we report a lot and we don't hear anything again. Open standards could help us have a language where we say, well, I tell you this and you can tell me that. So would allow us to open a little bit. So this was the first message. And I'm really sorry for the speed, but 15 minutes is very short. So first message, financial sector, growing demand for standards, and open standards would be the answer to allow us to not get stuck into this. Of course, there's a circular reference here, because if I ask for one standard more, and we don't simplify what is existing, well, it's just one standard more that have to synchronize with everything else. So the effort here is, how do we reduce complexity? So the call for standards is a call for a reduction of complexity, not yet for yet another abstraction layer on top of everything else. Second message, open source model for large or global enterprise collaboration. What is the challenge we face? I mean, I've mentioned this large number of engineers over 35 countries. And there is one big dilemma that we face is, well, we want to be more and more global with some solutions, which means that engineers at the periphery are going to be losing. Because if you are an infra engineer in Spain and we converge everything on global infra, well, at some point you don't have anything more to do. Right? And that creates a lot of tension and resistance to transformation. And open source can help us in that space, because if you can separate assets from people, I can engage my engineers in an open source way because the assets are common, but the brains are distributed. And that's an operating model that we are mimicking a little bit, because it allows me to build on talent, and it allows me to reduce resistance for transformation, because it's not Italy loses, Netherlands wins, but it is that global asset is the convergence point, and anyone that is good enough wins. Second message, open source for large-scale enterprise collaboration. Third message, open source for talents. Well, the first observation is a fascinating one. Most outstanding engineers are in the open source space. Most outstanding engineers are in the open source space, right? And that's a vivid example of why living, breathing, adopting, using open source is so crucial for a company which is built on technology, because this is where I find real talent, right? So that's the first hot message. Second one, open source is a platform for technical discourse, because when you commit on a project and you get trashed by the reviewers, well, that's a discourse. Right? That's pretty simple. It's not a conversation on PowerPoint. It either works or not, but it's a very substantial and material way of interacting. Second point is I call it a Darwinist mechanism to arbitrate among ayatollahs. Right? So remember the Linux versus Windows discussion. I know it's a sin to mention it here, but you remember how divisive that conversation was in companies. Well, open source models are a fascinating way to have the best truly emerge beyond what the individual believes is his pet technology, pet approach, pet architecture, pet project. Because if it's a pet project of one, well, it's your pet project. If it's a pet project and becomes the one of 1,000, then probably your opinion counts, right? So it's I wouldn't call it a capitalistic way, but it's definitely a Darwinistic mechanism where the best can emerge. And last point, open source plays also a social role for disadvantaged categories. I know this is completely off topic, even more if you hear it from a bank, right? Because you would say, well, this is the antithesis of what a bank is. ING is a very strong fiber in diversity and inclusion, so that plays a role to us. And the point here is the following. Knowledge today is free, right? You want to learn anything, Stanford just announced they opened their AI programs. You can go there and learn them, right? So there is an excessive amount of knowledge. It's free, but you need to have time for it, dedication, and usually some mentor and coaching. And there are plenty of phenomenal foundations that are investing in disadvantaged categories to bring them up to speed on knowledge, which is good. Problem behind, technology and theory is not marketable. If we get a candidate at the door that is, I have 20 certificates in C or Python or whatever you fancy, little value. Open source is the answer. Because open source is the place where you can develop skills that are very marketable. If I get somebody that knocking at the door say, well, I'm a guru in open telemetry and these are my 500 last commits, well, you have a story to tell, I can assure you. And that is free too. You don't have to pay anyone for a certificate in anything. That's hardcore knowledge. So this is where I believe open source plays a role. Last point, digital sovereignty. I mean, I've heard it before here, and it's clear there is a lot of sensitivity to geopolitics. We don't do politics, so we don't really care for politics as such, but the geopolitical context has an implication on risk. And this is where there is a hell of a lot of sensitivity currently, is on anything about resiliency, reliability, but in particular resiliency. Because of some blips in the storyline. If you see Starlink shut down 3 days in Ukraine, well, if they can shut down in Ukraine, they can shut down here. Well, we're not using Starlink. You would say, well, there's plenty of other components in the stack where the risk is absolutely there. And that links with the historical evolution of the commercial tech models, because without noticing, we are in a world of software as a service. Right? We had licenses inside our data centers. Now we consume software as a service. And that has completely changed the level of dependency on third parties. It is a bit what happened in the car manufacturing. There was an example on car manufacturing before. Car manufacturing, when they went just in time, Kanban, Kaizen, and all the story behind. Today, if Brembo in Italy or Bosch in Germany has a stop in their production line, there are 1 or 2 car manufacturing producers that have to stop their production lines because there is no stock in between. That's equivalent of software service dependency. If Microsoft pulls the plug on us on Active Directory, well, I can close the bank, essentially, right? So the point here is that what happened on the transformation in the way we consume technology has been fascinating and powerful, but has created a number of new risks. And now if you forget for a second geopolitics per se, you see how the chain of third-party risk is profound. Last week, AWS went down. I mean, we all have hypotheses what it was, right? Because besides declarations, well, we had our call center solution is a SaaS solution. They are in Europe on AWS, but they happened to have something that was calling back to the US. They went down. Our call centers were closed, right? And now that chain of dependency is a crazy one. Because when you really start grabbing, you also notice how we are paranoid on our cybersecurity, disaster recovery, and everything else. Not all of our third parties are. Right? Because when you want to just sell a piece of software, right, you want to have the piece of software to sell. All the reliability reflections behind. Or take the CrowdStrike example. Right? So there was a stupid change problem that broke the half of the world. So the tech models have massively changed our dependency from tech provider. And now this is where geopolitics and tech comes together. My Ukraine example of before. Suddenly technology can be weaponized. Weaponized in a war state, but also in phases before that, right? When you get, any cloud provider that shuts down a bank because for the regulation of their country, they should be sanctioned, and for the regulation of the others, they should not. Right? So these are cases that are extremely tricky from a reliability perspective. And to make you an example, or to illustrate what that means, our treasury has about 24 hours of autonomy. So if I lose treasury for 24 hours, the bank goes belly up, and probably a couple of other banks too. Right? So the systemic risk we're facing in that reliability chain is extreme. That's why the digital sovereignty conversation. So digital sovereignty is not, we want to have the assets in Europe. That train is long gone. We are dependent completely from Israel for cybersecurity, US for large CSPs, and plenty of others. Right? So the dependency is a question of how do we manage the risk. Open source in itself is not promoting, it's not for or it's not against digital sovereignty. It's just a tool that we can build on. But it could be the backbone of an alternate cloud stack. Now, that statement is a very hot one, right? Because Europe has tried at least twice to create a European public cloud. I mean, Gaia X was the phenomenal tentative first, and then another one was called, I think, EDOC. I might be wrong on the name, but it's another tentative. And all of them were political tentatives. Politicians believe, I can build something, here is the money, here is the idea, go out and build it. Surprise, surprise, it never flies, right? And what happens in that space, and this is where, if I look at by the way, and the other element is, of course, we do have European cloud providers. Some of them are even not just rehosting US licenses, but they have own stacks. Now, what is the challenge with that? They are phenomenal because we are testing them, except they stop at a very low layer in the stack. As soon as you go with advanced platform services, nothing is there. Right? And this is the place where we are making the difference. Getting a container or a VM is a trivial act for us. And this is where we get alternatives, sadly. Where it becomes sophisticated, we don't see alternatives. Now, if you take your preferred CSP catalog of services you can consume, right? For each of them, there is an open source project, right? Because we went there and we checked it out. How comes there is not a European cloud or an open source cloud to say that is built on this? Well, a little bit links with the fragmentation challenge I was mentioning before. As long as Europe keeps, spreading money on many small things, and each of them is forking their project because I need to get money first, and then I will see about market, nothing is going to emerge in that space. Now, how can open source be backbone of an alternate cloud stack? First of all, it's definitely a collaboration history. I mean, open source is a platform effort and collaboration among organizations like we do in industry, but also between public and private. And we have a couple of collaborations. But also, and this is where the open source cloud stack plays a role, portability is emerging as a desirable property, right? Because in this huge dependency on third parties, portability might be a part of the answer. If you can redeploy my data center in a bare metal as a service context in a matter of hours, well, I'm reducing or I'm mitigating my reliability risk on a part of my supply chain, for example, right? But in general, portability requires open standards, right? And I would say, well, yeah, we have Kubernetes. Well, yes, but, right? That's, it's a microscopic element in the grand scheme of how the things are together. Maybe open source can help there. Last point, of course, risks. Open source has an element of purity, right? That's why we get so many outstanding engineers, but it's also not without risks. One is, of course, the depending on maintainers. We see with our 50 projects, I know who the maintainers are in the organizations, it's few people. Now, if somebody is consuming my project, how can I assure that this product will be there for long enough to really build an enterprise on, right? So the dependence is there. Maintainers have an insider risk. How can I exclude that malicious criminal or state actors are infiltrating projects and essentially I'm sucking in their code because it looks nice to everybody else, but it is completely tricky. Concentration risk. You might remember blockchain at the beginning, distributed ledger. Each of you has a copy of the ledger on their machine, so that's complete democratization, whatever the word is, of that. It ended up there is only few players with very large machines with very large chains on that, right? Same risk here. What is the concentration risk if suddenly I get an open source project, but it is just an expression of one single company behind? Then I buy directly a piece of software from the company, so open source is no longer a value in itself. Also, the element of the contribution model. There was a very good, very interesting comment before on the purity of the open source model. Engineers that donate time to projects, right? That's a very delicate element the moment where open source become more enterprise-wide and because that pure dedication to projects is free. So you don't control how this is moving, but how can you, maintain interest in the space? And the other one is AI slopware creep. How can I exclude it in my favorite open source project? I will not get, I use a polite word, bad software flown in because somebody wants to tune up his KPI on the number of commits, and he keeps spitting in GenAI generated code that does microscopic things, but is absolutely subpar, right? So that's the other element that we need to look at. So I only had 15 minutes. I think I'm over. So keep the 4 messages. Financial sectors, we need open standards. Open source with their methods, methodologies can be an answer. Second message, open source for us egoistically is a way of engaging people beyond boundaries and to get the best out of our talent. Third message, talents. Open source is a phenomenal talent magnet, right? So we need to really build on this. And the last element, yes, digital sovereignty, which is the label, but essentially digital reliability, open source can play a role in that space. 15 minutes. I hope I didn't spoil your upcoming lunch, which is, I think, what is next. Thank you.